So, although the Star Citizen project is still under current development, it is playable, and it has a large worldwide following and many supporters. Being under development means that there are features that are, underdeveloped, missing, being planned in the works, waiting to be implemented, or just outright broken, which changes with some regular frequency. It is my belief that the unfinished nature of the project is what makes it valuable as a sociological study of online communities, and the fact that features of the game are still under development means that much about the game is unpredictable. Although there are playable missions, it is not clear which missions work and which do not. Players share information in real time with one another to try and add some predictability, but just like real life, experience is often the best judge. In other words, Star Citizen is a massive multiplayer online space simulator that, though playable, is currently being developed by Cloud Imperium Games, CIG, and it is my view that the unfinished and unpredictable nature of Star Citizen's virtual environment, makes it most suitable for the following theoretical usage. So, imagination plays a central role in the activities of everyday life. These activities can include pretending to be a princess in a faraway land, to pretending that a foreign threat has infiltrated your national defenses through a critical security gap. Noticeably, these are two very different uses for imagining and the faculty of imagination, and philosophers call the first the transcendent use of imagination, and they call the latter the instructive use of imagination. Here's Kendall Walton in his 1990 book, Mimesis as Make-Believe, page 13. He says, "When we think about the imagination, examples like the following naturally come to mind. Fred finds himself in an idle moment alone with his thoughts, feeling unsuccessful and unappreciated. He embarks on a daydream in which he is rich and famous. He calls up images of applauding constituents, visiting dignitaries, a huge mansion, doting women, and fancy cars. But alas, reality eventually reasserts itself and Fred gets back to selling shoes." Now, the former use of imagination, the transcendent one, affords us the opportunity to transcend reality, and the latter use of imagination, the instructive one, teaches us something about reality. Now, philosophers often argue that this represents us a puzzle, namely, how one mental activity can be both transcendent and instructive at the same time. This current project exploits the ability of the imaginative use of imagination to explore and examine philosophically theoretical concepts using Star Citizen. The best way to understand the puzzle of the imaginative use of the imagination is to start somewhere close enough to the beginning. While our focus is the imagination, our starting point will be art. Why art, you ask? Well, because art stimulates our imagination. What is art, you ask? Well, of course, there are examples of art, and these include paintings, novels, stories, plays, films, and of course, games. Now, are we talking all games? Some games? Of course, video games are certainly going to fit the bill, but what about board games? Well, one way to answer questions about what other objects might be representative of artwork is to ask what we just mentioned, the paintings, novels, stories, and so on, have in common. Well, one thing that they all have in common is that they're all representational. And they are representative of something about our experience or about human experience more broadly. So one way to determine whether something fits an art category is to ask ourselves whether it is representative. But this brings more questions. What about flowcharts as they represent processes? Are they art since they're representative? Well, diagrams can also represent something, namely diagrams often represent data, and other things represent data too, such as spreadsheets, charts, graphs. Are these items also art? Well, so another way to delineate between whether something is representatively a representative artwork and representative non-artwork is to consider whether one is fictional or not. And this, once again, according to Kendall Walton. I will carve out a new category, one we might think of as a principled modification, not just a clarification or refinement of an ordinary notion of representational art. I will call its members simply representation, preempting this expression for my own purposes and assigning it an extension both broader and narrower than it is usually understood to possess. The works of representational art most likely to spring to mind are, like our initial examples, works of fiction. Novels, stories, and tales, for instance, among literary works rather than biographies, histories, and textbooks. So the fact that something is fiction means that it will more likely make it a work of art or a piece of artwork. But what else? Well, let's consider what fiction is. Fiction means that something is made up, that is, make-believe. Now, why is this important? Well, first consider that there are various cognitive faculties, and that each of our cognitive faculties perform a particular role in or some kind of mental activity. For instance, belief is a cognitive faculty that deals with things that are either true or false. We can either have true belief, say when we believe that we will be late to the opera, or a false belief, say that we are wrong that we will be late to the opera. Now, there are other mental faculties. These include imagination or desire. Imagination deals with things that are, both of these deal with things that are neither true nor false. So unlike belief, imagination and desire do not deal with the way things are, but deal with the way things are something else. So for instance, we might desire to eat chocolate. Unlike belief, desire is not an apprehension of the way that the world is, but of the way we want the world to be. What about imagination? Well, imagination, once again, is not an apprehension of the way the world is, but rather, and also imagination is not how we want the world to be. So what is imagination? Imagination is about how we want, it's not about how we want the world to be, but how the world might be. So we might say that belief is about the way the world is, desire is about how we want the world to be, and imagination is about how the world could be, how it's possible to be.